Hello and welcome to our special episode called World Cup Rewind, where we look back at each edition of the biggest prize in cricket. And what better place to start than by looking at the 1983 World Cup. Yes, there were two World Cup editions before that, but there's a reason why we're starting with 1983. Now, 1983, if you are of Rajdeep's vintage, you'll remember that that was the year where Motorola actually first rolled out their first mobile phones. That was the year where the most famous video game of all times, Super Mario, was released by a Japanese game maker. That was also the year where the infamous Bandit Queen surrendered herself. But if you ask any Indian, what do you remember 1983 by? And he'll say the triumph at the Cricket World Cup. We are on that location, virtually, I might add, at the Lord's Cricket Ground. I'm going to be your pilot for the evening, and joining me, my co-pilot in Rajdeep Sardesai. And Rajdeep was one of those lucky few who got to see that final. I know you're eager to talk about that final, but we'll get to that a little later. Let's start with your memories before that World Cup. I've not included 75, 79. Like most other Indians, have you forgotten those two World Cups because of how India performed?
You know, Nikhil, I was 18 in 1983, so it was for me a coming-of-age moment. I turned 18 a month before India won that World Cup. So lots of great memories around 83, which we'll talk about. But let's be honest, Indian cricket in the late 70s and early 80s, when it came to one-day cricket, was pretty awful. We just didn't quite get the game. I remember once asking Sunil Gavaskar, the great Sunil Gavaskar, how did you score 36 in 60 overs in the first World Cup? And he said, look, I was at a stage where my mind was frozen and I was looking for ways to get out, but because I was a test player whose entire responsibility was not to get out, I just didn't get out for 60 overs and I scored 36 runs. And I didn't understand for a long while what one-day cricket was all about. And what was true about the great Gavaskar was true about the entire Indian team in those early years of one-day cricket, which included two World Cups. So the only team that we beat in the first two World Cups is East Africa.
Yes.
So when you think back to it, we go into this 1983 World Cup, Nikhil, honestly, with zero expectations. You know, it was sub-zero almost. I was in England at the time playing league cricket, like a number of young people would go to play league cricket in the summer in England. And frankly, there was no excitement or buzz around the Indian team at all. I would even dare say the World Cup itself was not as big as it was today, but the Indian team certainly was completely under the radar. All of us were sort of so obsessed with these great West Indians that nothing else mattered. So you mentioned Motorola, you know, I could talk about ECTV. You know, in those days, the TV was such that you had to, if the signal went, you had to hit it hard from the side and suddenly the signal would come out. This was the India, black and white TV, by and large. Color had just come in 82 with the Asian Games. But we were living in a very innocent age. We used pens, we used trunk calls. You had to fix a number. If you wanted to get through to London, you had to be in queue. Aapka number Qatar mein hai. Can you imagine in the age of mobiles? This was the nature of communication. It was a completely different India, probably just as you were getting born.
Yes, I was born though by the time the 83 World Cup had happened, but I was too small to remember many things. But then I had the privilege of writing a book on that, so I did extensive research. Going back to India's build-up and why that is really important, as Rajdeep mentioned, there was only one game that they had won before that. So India had played, remember, 6 World Cup games before reaching the 1983 World Cup, and their record was 5-1. 5 games they lost. They won against a team called East Africa, which many thought were, you know, professionals, semi-professionals, you know, team made up of a few businessmen here and there. They would just come together to play weekend cricket, and so you made a team called East Africa. That was the only team that India beat, that too in 75. In 79, the edition that happened before the 83 World Cup, India's record there was 3-0, which actually at that time prompted a lot of English writers to even write that India should not be even invited to a World Cup because India is not fit enough to be playing at a world stage. That's how poor India's record was.
I mean, they were ranked. No one talked about the Indian team when it came to the World Cup. It was being played in England. England had a very good team at that time. You know, Botham was in his pomp in a way, and everybody thought that, you know, this was England's moment. And the West Indies, I mean, Nikhil, I have seen teams and teams. The West Indies team of 1983 was arguably the best team that has ever assembled on a cricket field, certainly in one-day cricket, led by the mighty Viv Richards. I mean, led meaning, batting-wise, led by the mighty Viv Richards.
But there was, of course, Clive Lloyd, who was the captain. We'll get into that first game that India played against the West Indies. But there was a silver lining, because we're talking about the build-up. As I mentioned, they had just won one game in the World Cup. In those 3 practice games that India played, they happened to win their last practice game, and that might have given them some sort of confidence. They were playing against Sri Lanka. 265 is what they were chasing. Yashpal Sharma gets 90, 60 odd for Kapil Dev. India win that game versus Sri Lanka, a practice game at that. I believe Gary Sobers at that time was a consultant with Sri Lankan cricket, and he says that, as he's been quoted, that was the time when he saw a team of all-rounders. He said, you know what, watch out for this Indian team. They could cause a few upsets going forward in the tournament. Gary Sobers could have been the first guy who actually picked India to do something in that 83 World Cup.
Just a few months before that, India had gone on a tour of the West Indies.
Yes.
And as I said, a mighty West Indian team in the West Indies. And they go to Guyana and win a match in a place called Berbice, where Gavaskar gets runs. And, you know, it was almost as if the Gavaskar of 1975, scoring 36 runs in 60 overs, was now being replaced by this new Gavaskar, who understood his responsibility as a one-day cricketer. And we actually beat the mighty West Indies for the first time in Berbice in Guyana 3 months before the World Cup. And I think that, you ask the players of that time, I think that's the first time they realized just what their potential was, that they had the potential to take on the Windies. And I think the big change, Nikhil, is Kapil Dev. You know, Kapil Dev changed the face of Indian cricket, because until then, I think the concept of having this sort of all-rounder who could decimate the opposition when it came to the bat and could really, you know, bowl the odd bouncer at other batsmen. I think he redefined Indian cricket in the early 80s. So I think the team began to reflect the persona, in a way, of Kapil Dev. And I think without Kapil Dev there, 83 would never have happened. Kapil Dev da jawab nahi, boss. Kapil Dev da jawab nahi.
Because that game, we remember, and we'll get to the final about Gordon Greenidge getting out to Balwinder Sandhu. It was exactly something like that happened in this game in Berbice 11 weeks before the World Cup, where Balwinder Sandhu gets both the openers in Desmond Haynes, Greenidge. Apparently, I haven't seen the match highlights, apparently in quite the similar fashion, he gets Greenidge in Berbice, and only to repeat it in the finals then.
You know, when Balwinder Sandhu got all those wickets, including that wicket in the final, which is a ball to remember. You remember a match, but you remember a particular ball. It's Balwinder Singh Sandhu in the final. He used to play club cricket with us, Ballu, we used to call him. And I remember him coming back after 83 and playing a Kanga League match. And I actually hit him for 6. Now, this is not, you know, I wasn't a great cricketer. I was good enough, you know, to play under 19 level. But I can tell you that for us to see Balwinder Sandhu, our sort of club mate or club opponent, there on the big stage, getting the great Gordon Greenidge bowled, I think, you know, the moment Ballu came back from England, we were playing some Maidan match and I hit him for this 6. And I remember my non-striker coming, yaar, tu to Gordon Greenidge se bhi better batsman ban gaya. You know, suddenly, you know, we were, all our reference points in that year 83 were all linked to the World Cup. And, you know, Balwinder Singh Sandhu may not have got 100 test wickets, may not have scored 1,000 test runs, but that wicket of Greenidge, the fact that it was so crucial to that World Cup, he will be remembered forever. I think that's what 83 did. I know I'm now 58, 40 years ago. I still remember that World Cup as a moment I will never forget. We'll come to the final, but it was really very, very special.
Interesting that Rajdeep talks about that Berbice win. From Berbice, we've now come to England at the famous Lord's balcony. But the journey to reach this balcony for the Indian team took some time. Before that, their first game at that 1983 World Cup, guess who they faced once again? West Indies, the best team, as Rajdeep mentioned, best team that he's ever seen, the defending champions, also the ones that have just beaten them on that tour that India did. We spoke about the Berbice win. That was the lone victory that India had in the test matches and ODIs that India played. Now, They're going to face the world champions. That game happens in Manchester. And we keep talking about comebacks, and we'll talk about the comeback that India did in that Zimbabwe game a little later, but there was a minor comeback here. India batting first. This was, again, interestingly, Rajdeep, the one game that started on the 9th of June and finished on the 10th of June. And that becomes very important because the rub of the green here goes India's way. Clive Lloyd wins the toss. India get to bat on a nice, bright, sunny day in Manchester. They're 141 for 5, but from there on, you have Yashpal Sharma with 89. He stitches together a 70-plus run partnership with Roger Binney. 262 for 6 is what India reach. And you think West Indies could still chase that in 60 overs, but guess what? There are about 60-something for 2. Rain comes down, play is halted. The game goes on to the 10th of June. 10th of June is an overcast day in England. Plenty of help there for the Indian bowlers, and as things turn out, India win that game against West Indies. So a great start of that World Cup.
You know, in England, as I said, you often don't just look at the pitch on the ground, but you also look at what's in the sky. And I think that made a huge difference. That second day, reserve day, was when the ball started moving and the West Indians were in trouble. But Yashpal Sharma, you know, in a way, man of the match in that first game. And part of this revolution that was coming in with Kapil Dev, as we discussed, this younger brand of Indian cricketers, much more attuned to being better fielders, more robust in a way with their batting, and ready to give it as good as they got. You know, I'm told that Yashpal Sharma once confronted Dennis Lillee. Kaun hai tum Lillee? You know, he was ready to sort of have a fight, not the greatest English. Anshuman Gaikwad tells a great story. Yashpal Sharma in the dressing room said, "Mujhe STD hua hai, STD hua hai." And then it turns out, "Mujhe acidity hua hai." So, you know, Yashpal Sharma was, you know, his English apart, he was the kind of defiant, he symbolized this new defiance of Indian cricket. Number of cricketers then coming in from the North Zone. So, you know, they were also used to the colder conditions, and they were able to, in a way, almost adjust faster to that early English summer. But that was a great innings. In a way, set the platform again that yes, we can beat the West Indies. And remember, Nikhil, this was the first defeat the West Indies had ever suffered across 3 World Cups. They didn't lose a game in 75, didn't lose a game in 79, come to 83 World Cups as overwhelming favourites and lose the first game against the minnows India. Look at how the world has changed. Today, the West Indies have not qualified for this year's World Cup. Yes. And India are one of the favourites.
All right, India won that particular game by 34 runs. As Rajdeep points out, Yashpal Sharma, the man of the match, some big hitting from him. And he's talking about his mates. His mates would call his shots badam shots because he was that one guy who would eat almonds all the time. And he'd tell everyone that, you know, I'm a vegetarian. You guys get your proteins by eating non-veg, and I need some vegetarian protein. So almonds is what he would eat all the time. And those big hits were called badam shot by the Indian team. And those badam shots, in short, India started on a very good note. But from there on, just like any film, and I know there's a film that has been made about the 83 World Cup, you start on a high, but then there is going to be some sort of a climax coming, right? Act 2 is where India then start to falter. They win their next game against Zimbabwe, but then they have 2 big losses. One against Australia, they lose in Trent Bridge, where Australia get about 320 runs, 100 for Trevor Chappell. Yallop gets a lot of runs then towards the end, and India lose that game at Trent Bridge. From there on, India again meet the West Indies, and it is a one-sided encounter. Viv Richards is the star. They play at the Oval, and this time West Indies beats them again.
I saw that game at the Oval, and my memory of that game is Malcolm Marshall. There hasn't been a better fast bowler the world has seen, and I will never forget that when he hit Vengsarkar on the face, you were sitting in the crowd, but you almost felt the thud. You know, it was raw pace. This was Marshall, a young Malcolm Marshall. Vengsarkar was batting beautifully, had scored runs in that game, and then gets hit on the face, which sort of virtually ruled him out of the tournament. But you then realize that the same West Indians whom you defeated in game 1 were back.
Yes.
And, you know, it was pretty frightening. Watching the West Indians bowl was frightening, even in the audience. Not forget about being 22 yards away from them. They were quick, nasty, and very, very good.
India played 2 games, one against Zimbabwe and then a game to follow against Australia. India need to win both games to ensure that they qualify for the semi-finals. 10-17 for 5. And arguably, you can have various knocks that have gone past it, but arguably, Sunil Gavaskar still says to the day that the greatest one-day knock that he's ever seen, not just as a player, but even as a commentator till today, he says he's never seen a better knock. 17 for 5, Kapil Dev's 175 at Tunbridge Wells.
You know, there are regrets you have in life. One of my great regrets is I was 150 kilometers away in a place called Worthing in Sussex. And this match was Tunbridge Wells in Kent, not too far away. And yet, when you looked at the list of matches, you said, "Yaar, ye match to dekhna nahi hai." So I'd gone to see West Indies, India West Indies at the Oval, but I didn't go to see India Zimbabwe at Tunbridge Wells, thinking, you know, A, India is likely to win. B, do I really want to travel 150 kilometers? I didn't have that much money in my pocket to go and see Zimbabwe. It was a good Zimbabwe side, mind you. You know, they defeated the Australians in one of the games. They were a good
first game.
That's right. So they were a very good, you know, the likes of David Houghton, Curran, they were all very, very good cricketers. But it is the
Just
story.
to give a context to our viewers, tell who Kevin Curran was. This generation will only know Sam Curran.
Yeah, that's right.
The father.
Father of Sam Curran, and you know, a very, very good cricketer. These were Zimbabwean cricketers who were coming into their own. For them also, this was a chance to show their prowess on the world stage. Many of them played county cricket, so they knew how to bowl in England.
Duncan Fletcher, we are aware
That's
of.
right. And
He was our coach.
17 for 5, when you think about it. And you know, the stories that have been wrapped around it about how Kapil Dev was still in his towel when he suddenly told that he's got to go out and bat. P.R. Mansingh was standing in one spot and then was kept standing in that same spot. Shrikant was there with his wife in a corner. Look, the entire atmosphere probably was that, you know, 17 for 5, 9 times out of 10 you lose one-day cricket. The good thing about it was 60 overs. We sometimes forget that World Cup was 60 overs. The first 3 World Cups were all 60 overs. So it gave you a little bit more time to get back into the game. And then Kapil Dev. You know, what do you say? I mean, there are stories and stories about Kapil Dev. One of his early stories was in Pakistan, where he first went in 1978-79, and he sent as a night watchman. And Bishan Singh Bedi told him, "Tum khade raho wahan. You have to stand on the wicket, night watchman." Kapil Dev goes and does bang, 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 hits 3 4s, comes back smiling. Bishan Singh Bedi looks at, "Arey, maine tere ko kaha tha khade rahe, stay on the wicket." He said, "To main to khada raha, I'm not out." But that's the way he played. You know, he even redefined the role of a night watchman. You see, this was a cricketer for whom nothing was impossible. I think because he came with a complete blank memory. He tells me a great story that he'd never seen a test match in his life till he played a test match. Think about it. Kapil Dev had never seen a test match in his life till he plays his first test in Pakistan in 1978. So there was a blank memory. He wasn't worried about who was the opposition. He just had natural ability. And I think that day in Tunbridge Wells, unfortunately not available on television, probably not because necessarily only of the strike. But the fact was, I think the BBC didn't see it as a priority match.
The other thing, there was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Brown, who is the Zimbabwean manager, and there is a match report written by one of the newspapers. So the writer there speaks to the manager of the Zimbabwean team, and the Zimbabwean manager is telling him that, you know, I just got a call from BBC, and they've called me when India is 17 for 5, and the reporter who's assigned to go and get the post-match interviews calls up the landline of that ground and speaks to the Zimbabwean manager saying that it's 17 for 5. Should I come in early because this game is going to get over? And Mr. Brown, the manager of the Zimbabwe team, says, you know what, he uses a cliche. Cricket is a game of uncertainties, so don't do that. And then the BBC reporter doesn't come in early. So by all accounts, BBC wasn't on strike. It's just that it wasn't a game important enough for them to cover. They're going to rue that opportunity because arguably the greatest knock was played on that day. 2 very lesser known things about that knock. One, that Kapil Dev used a different sort of a bat. It was the mongoose bat, not the regular bat. He did start off with a regular bat, but once he got going, once he was timing the ball very well, he got a mongoose bat. And the other lesser known bit that you actually, and a lot of players, Yashpal included, told me that the ball was really seeming around very tough to play. But then there was a shot that Kapil Dev hits when he's on 30 odd. He hits it, it goes out of the ground. they couldn't retrieve the ball, they changed the ball, and they say that that particular ball, and quite happens in cricket quite often, that when the ball is changed, it wasn't really doing that much as the previous ball, and from there on, it became a batting paradise, and Kapil Dev got that
Just to say,
175.
Mangu's bat, we look at the bat and the shape of the bat had changed with the Mangu's bat. It had a sort of broader, slightly broader center.
And no edges.
But remember, these bats were still nowhere as good as what the bats are today.
Oh,
so
yes.
just think about it. If Kapil Dev could score with the Mangu's bat and hit out of the ground, imagine what he would have done with today's bats. Think about it.
Okay, so India win that game versus Zimbabwe, must win, but they've still not qualified for the semi-final. They play Australians, and that is another game that they win. After that, they qualify for the semi-final. And next up, we're going to look at that semi-final because it is India versus the host, and now looking like the tournament favorite alongside West Indies, the English team. The last two games of this World Cup, two knockouts now, India versus England in the semi-finals. And why is this game very important? Because of the build-up to this particular encounter. One thing, the English media, which has been partisan on most occasions, was exactly that even that time around. You had David Frith, the Wisden editor, who at the start of the tournament had said India shouldn't be even invited for this World Cup, now coming face to face for the very first time against this Indian team. The headlines on the newspapers wasn't even discussing what England needs to do versus India. Every headline there was talking about what England must do when they face West Indies in the final. So they weren't even looking at the semi-final. And I think the last straw on the camel's back, which really got India's goat, was the fact that there was a BBC program that was being aired on the eve of that semi-final. Graham Fowler, one of the members of that English team, was invited as the guest. And even he did not discuss anything that had to do with the semi-final. Graham Fowler was talking about how he would be facing on the West Indian Quicks when they play the final at Lord's. So that was the build-up. Speaking to a few members of that 83 team, they said that that is exactly what really fired them. They went into that game versus England knowing fully well, kuch bhi ho jaye, that karo ya maro, we have to beat this particular team in their backyard.
I was staying with an English family while playing club cricket. And they had picked up tickets for the final because they were very confident that England was going to make it. Look, England, has always had this belief that they invented the game and therefore this was their moment. They'd been beaten in '79 in the final by the West Indians, and this family I was staying with was convinced that it was an England-West Indies final. In fact, they said, look at England's luck. We're playing India in the semis. We don't have to face Australia or New Zealand or some of the other. New Zealand
or even Pakistan.
Or even Pakistan. Pakistan played the other semis.
Yes.
So they were rejoicing in the fact that it was England versus India. And sometimes in life and in cricket, overconfidence can be extremely damaging. So I think the English took India lightly. I remember interviewing Ian Botham many years later, and he said, honestly, I had never seen this bowler Kirti Azad bowl. I'd never heard of Kirti Azad, honestly. And Kirti Azad bowls what the ball of the tournament along with Balwinder Singh Sandhu's, which is a sursura. Yeah. Sursura is the ball which just goes along the ground. And the ball never got up. Kirti Azad has been dining out on that ball for 40 years. Every time you sit with Kirti Azad in a room, after 15 minutes, he tells you how he got Ian Botham bowled. मैंने plan किया था. I mean, can you plan a sursura? But Ian Botham had never watched Kirti Azad bowl. So maybe he was the surprise element. And I think the Indian team just surprised England with the intensity with which they played the match. They just weren't prepared for that kind of intensity. And a good English side at that really couldn't handle India. We just had moments after moments in that match. That run out by Yashpal Sharma, yes. The six that he hits of Bob Willis, a shot that will stay in memory. Mohinder Amarnath's wonderful batting. It was just about the perfect day. Sandeep Patil, coming to the party. Lots of names, lots of memories. I was sitting and watching the game with this English family, and they didn't know what had hit them. They just didn't know what had hit them. Morning, they told me they're going to watch the final, England versus West Indies. By the early part of the evening, it was very, very different. Very different.
I think that one moment, as Rajdeep talks about, that really changed that game was that dismissal of Ian Botham. The joke since that time has been that that ball actually went below sea level. That's how low it was. He calls it a susura. People said it was below sea level. Ian Botham was very angry. From various accounts that I hear, he went in, smashed a chair or two in the dressing room, was very upset. There's one poster that I remember reading about it, and even in the highlights, because those highlights are available, where you see a fan really holding a poster which says, Kapil eats Botham for breakfast. That became, if it had been, today's day and age, social media, that would have gone viral, because it was also built up as this battle of the two best all-rounders in the world alongside Imran Khan. And so Ian Botham versus Kapil Dev, that's how this battle was there. 213 all out, England, that is what they could manage. For India, once again, Yashpal Sharma, the star of the show, as Rajdeep points out, it was the same ground, Manchester, where he got that 89 versus West Indies. He was playing there in Manchester once again. The shot that Rajdeep talks about, that 6 behind square leg for 6 of Bob Willis. There is a history to that too. Yashpal says that because Mohinder Ramanath at that time is telling him, don't take risks, don't get out, we have to finish this game. And Yashpal goes and tells Mohinder Ramanath, who's a non-striker, that you know what, these guys, when I got my 100 in Chennai against England, both Botham and Bob Willis were not clapping, they weren't cheering, they were sledging me. And I remember that. And so he says that, he was inspired by that, he was angry, and he was also inspired by Viv Richards, because at 79 final, Viv gets 100, and that's a similar 6 that he hits. Yashpal, coincidentally, was sitting in the stands watching that 79 final. So he knew that I need to shuffle across my off stump and probably flick it around square leg for 6, and he said that is something that he picked up from Viv Richards. Plenty of anecdotes from the game, but as I said, we were building up to this game saying, England versus India and all the things that the press wrote. They did a 360-degree turn, because the headlines that came after that, they were praising, they were trying to find connections, as it happens with the English press. They said, Roger Binney, he's one of our own. He's the great-grandson of a Scotsman. So, things changed within that one particular game.
You mentioned earlier David Frith, who had written off India and said, I'll eat my hat if India wins this World Cup.
Eat my words.
Eat my words. And there he was sort of, at the end of the tournament, all set to sort of eat his words.
He did.
But, he burnt a copy of that article where he'd written it and starts eating it. So I think that win against England, and what I then did was that couple who had those 2 tickets to the World Cup final, I said, why don't you give them to me? And that's exactly what they did. And I had a group of friends who were here, who were from a college team, school team, Rajkumar College, which is a school in Rajkot. And they were there with Yajuvendra Singh, the former test player and world record holder for catches. And they were also in England. So they also managed tickets, because suddenly all the English were selling their tickets. There were £5, £10 tickets. Today tickets are 100, 150, 200 pounds, £10 tickets. And suddenly outside the ground, every Indian was ready to get a ticket. And remember, there weren't that many Indians in '83 compared to what we have today. We didn't have our army. Kya kehte hai uske? Bharat Army. We didn't have the Bharat Army around in blue. We were just going to have a good day out to watch India honestly give West Indies a fight, but with the belief that, end of the day, ये West Indies ही जीतेगा.
Okay, let's now break down that game. Rajdeep was lucky enough to be there. It's India versus West Indies. West Indies clearly smarting from that loss in the first game. They had their revenge in Oval, but clearly they must have had their eyes on that World Cup trophy, considering that the last 2 editions, they were the champions. Nobody really thought that India could do anything, and then India are put into bat. Not a great time that India has. The only one highlight that I can remember from when India was batting, and Rajdeep can then narrate what he saw and how the crowds were reacting, was that one shot by Chika ended up being the highest run getter with 30 odd, is that he goes down on his knee and there's a 4 that he hits of Andy Roberts, which later when I spoke to Chika, he said was kind of a tribute to Gundappa Vishwanath, who apparently was in the stands watching that game. His hero goes down on the knees, hits that 4, but that's the only highlight when it came to the Indian batting. 183.
It was a grey morning. And as I said, in England, you don't just look at the pitch, you also look at what's happening in the sky. And that's one of the reasons possibly, that India was batting. In fact, Kapil Dev comes back to the dressing room and says he was, the moment he said India was batting, there was a sort of palpable, sudden loss of confidence or a sense of gloom in the room. How are you going to face these 4 bowlers, the great Joel Garner, Andy Roberts, Marshall and Holding, on a cold morning in England. Typical Kapil Dev. Chalo, batting karni hai. Get ready. Everybody not so sure. But Kapil Dev was as usual enthused. And Chika was that kind of cricketer again. No real historical memory what had happened 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Played his cricket almost instinctively. And, he will of course tell you, as you said, that, I did it in memory of Vishwanath. But I think he was just the kind of instinctive cricketer you needed for an Indian team, where at the other hand, you had a Sunil Gavaskar who was struggling for form. You needed Chika to give you that lift on that day. I still remember that shot that he played, and we were somewhere in the point region, sitting in the stand. And in those days, all the stands were open. Nothing was closed. So, and I was surrounded by West Indians. And, they all had these Rastafarian colors. And they were dancing and drinking from 10:30 in the morning. And here I am, I was hoping that they'd pass on some of the booze to me. They didn't.
You were legally, yeah.
I was 18. This was celebration time, and I was a rum drinker.
Yeah.
And they had brought good Jamaican rum and beer. And it was flowing. They believed they had won that game. Chika, notwithstanding, they thought it was all done. And particularly at lunchtime. I'll never forget this. We were 9 wickets down, I think, at lunchtime. And because there was lunch and then the 60 overs would get over. Yes. Yajuvendra Singh, Indian cricketer, coach of this team, school team, tells me, I'm going home. I told you we are not going to win this game. My wife wants to go shopping. I'm going shopping. They were not, this was pre-mobile days. So even after lunch, as the match started to turn, we didn't know how to ring up Yajuvendra Singh and say, come back for God's sake. The match has turned. So Yajuvendra Singh had a ticket to the World Cup final, went away at lunch, and I've ribbed him for the rest of his life. You were not there to see India's great cricket moment.
Yeah, it was 183 what India got, and to rub salt into their wounds. There was also another incident that happened. Balwinder Sandhu gets hit on the head by a Malcolm Marshall bouncer. And at that time, times were so different. I still remember, looking at those highlights where Dickie Bird was the umpire. He actually went up to Marshall and said, apologize to him. He's a tail ender. Don't bowl him a bouncer. So he apologizes to him and, with just a wave of a hand, and then carries on. So 183, then you have the famous speech. We all know of, on the silver screen, you've got Shah Rukh Khan giving that Chak De speech. But much before that, you had Kapil Dev tell them that, listen, we've got 183 on board. They still have to get it. And then those proved to be prophetic words later.
Apparently, he said, Jawano, hum fight karenge. Jo bhi ho, fight karna hai. Now, I don't know, Kapil Dev, sometimes mixes his metaphors, and, he's not a great one for vocabulary. But what I like about Kapil even today is that he says it like he sees it. And, he was, I'll tell you, just a few weeks ago, I was in London and with Kapil Paji at the World Test Championship, and he took us out one evening to the Lahore, famous Lahore Kebab House, and run by Pakistanis. But the moment they saw Kapil Dev enter, they said 83 ka hero aa gaya. And we were served everything free of charge. So in a Pakistani restaurant in London, 40 years after 83, Kapil Dev was being served a free meal. That's the Kapil Dev da jawab nahi.
But what you're talking about jawab nahi, the one moment which probably changed the course of that game, Viv Richards going great gun, and then plays that one delivery, skies it, and an outstanding catch. Just a bit of an anecdote before, Rajdeep can recall. For viewers in India who were getting the semis and the finals were being telecast live, apparently the microwave signal went down. They could not watch that catch. And I believe they played recorded music of Mohammad Rafi. Songs were playing because the signal was down. You were lucky enough. You saw that catch live.
Madan Lal, again, great servant of Indian cricket. He keeps telling us he went to Kapil Dev and said, "Mujhe aur ek over de de." Richards was playing in typical, it looked like he wanted to finish the match in an hour. When you bowled in those days to Richard, middle and leg, he just hit you through mid-wicket time and again. And he'd hit Madan Lal for a couple of fours. Kapil Dev admits he was reluctant to give Madan Lal an over. Madan Lal said, "Nahi yaar, ek aur de de." And I think Richards would later tell me he got sort of carried away in a way. He thought, Madan Lal.
Can I just add one thing, Rajdeep?
Yes.
Again, doing research, when he takes that cake over there, which is absolutely correct, he doesn't get Viv. He actually gets Desmond Haynes. Because of that, he then gets another over, and that's when he gets Viv Richards. So he does ask for an over. He's getting hammered. He does ask for an over, but he gets Haynes before. And because he gets Haynes, he gets another over to get Viv.
And, and in those days, Viv Richards, frankly, was, and it's tough to say this, was Sachin Tendulkar and Virat Kohli rolled into one.
It's not tough to say.
He was chewing, smoking Joe.
Yeah.
He was not just a cricketer. He was, for us, for my generation, a phenomenon. You watch Viv Richards, he was the Muhammad Ali of cricket. He walked with a swagger onto the ground, and boy, when Viv Richards, he could intimidate bowlers. I'll never forget Imran Khan once telling me, bowlers are meant to intimidate batsmen. Viv Richards intimidated us. Apparently, Imran once bowled a bouncer, which Viv struggled and almost fell on his backside. Looks at Imran Khan. Imran looks at him, and Viv Richards just says this. Next ball, Imran bounces him again at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, largest ground in the world. Viv hit him into the stands. That was Viv Richards, no helmet, cap, big cap, and just, so therefore, when Viv Richards gets out and Kapil Dev takes that catch, I remember a few of us, you see in those days, you could actually, when a wicket, when you see the highlights, people rush onto the ground almost when there's a major moment. Kapil Dev gets the catch, you're running onto the ground. I didn't, but there were people around me, all running onto the ground to almost sort of hold on to Kapil Dev in the belief that maybe, just maybe, I think that was the moment when we thought, just maybe, this could be India's day.
Yeah, Yashpal Sharma, who was actually closer to the ball at that time, told me that once he saw Kapil run for that catch, he said, I better stand where I am standing because this man's going to do what he does best. So athletic Kapil Dev is. In all of our excitement of discussing the Viv Richards catch, we've forgotten probably the ball of the tournament. That was bowled before that. Again, talking about a legendary batsman, Gordon Greenidge, aggressive batsman. People talk about openers being aggressive. I think he was the gold standard at that time. He gets Greenidge with an in-swinger. Ball that bounces, cuts in, and then he shoulders his arms.
It's Lords. There's supposedly the slope where the ball does sometimes come in. And I kept, we would rip Balwinder Sandhu when he played club cricket with us. Yaar, Ballu, tu in-swing dal raha tha ki out-swing? Did you really know it was an in-swinger? And Ballu would say, no, maine to in-swinger ke liye dala tha. Now, we don't know whether that's true or not. But either way, I think typically Gordon Greenidge thought that Ballu was a traditional out-swing bowler. His stock ball was the out-swinger. Call it the Lord's slope or call it Ballu planning the dismissal or Guru ki kripa. Nobody knows with what that ball was. But I think Gordon Greenidge, much like Viv Richards, was again an intimidating force. He'd scored 100, I think, in the semi-finals against Pakistan, or got runs against Pakistan in the semi-finals. So he too he and Viv was seen, 183, you'll canter to it. So that dismissal of Greenidge and then the catch of Kapil Dev taking Viv Richards, it was a different world. Nikhil, think about it. You're in a stadium surrounded by West Indians who by 3 in the afternoon are completely smashed and are completely convinced that they're winning this match. By 4 or 5 in the evening, the mood has changed. Suddenly, and Indians were playing sort of the sort of drum beat of the West Indians was replaced by the dhol of Indians. So the drum was replaced by the dhol.
Maybe Sunil Gavaskar had something to do with that dismissal, because I read in a book where Balwinder Sandhu talks about, as Rajdeep was pointing, that outswinger was his natural delivery. And during one of the net practice sessions during the World Cup, Sunil Gavaskar actually tells Balwinder Sandhu that whenever you bowl an in-swinger, I get to know because it's very obvious. There is a change in your action, you make it very obvious. So try and hide that so that I do not realize that you're bowling an in-swinger. Maybe those tips that were given, yes, Sunil Gavaskar didn't have a great time with the bat, but maybe, those little tips he must have given here and there could have helped the Indian team do very well. He was talking about people leaving, his good friend leaving the final. As the story goes, a few of the star wives at that time also left. They went for shopping because they thought, the game was done and dusted. They were told by the security guard there that, listen, the ticket's not going to be valid. Once you leave, I'm not going to allow you back. And it so happened that they leave and then they only get to celebrate with their husbands after the game is done. Tell me when that game got over. I can only see visuals of people just running running onto the ground. That last bit, just talk us through it. I can remember Mohinder Ramanath running, trying to collect that stump, take it as a souvenir, people running onto the ground, and there's a sea of just fans on the ground as the Indians stand in that famous Lord's balcony. What was happening?
Nikhil, the West Indies are 6 down, and it looks like India is going to win, and then Dujon and Marshall have a partnership. So me and another friend, Jitu Parmar, from Saurashtra and Rajkot again, decide, yaar, walk ke liye chalte hain. So we start walking along the periphery of the ground, and we reach near the nursery end, and that's where Dujon gets out. And the moment Dujon gets out, Jitu tells me, idhar hi khada rahe, idhar se hatna nahi hai. This is lucky spot. I said, boss, hamara ticket chala jayega, let's go back to the stand. But we stood there and we saw 2 wickets fall there, Dujon and Marshall. And then just the 3 fast bowlers are left. So we rushed back to where, to be with all the others. The West Indians were silent by then. The dhols had begun. And we were just waiting for that one moment when we could rush on the ground. I couldn't in my life have imagined running on the ground. I grew up in a very traditional cricket family where rushing on the ground was not allowed. You might do it on the Maidan, but not at Lord's, for God's sake. My father was late father, test cricketer, was watching the match with NKP Salve. Then the board president, they were, closer to the members stand. And I remember telling my dad later that, where were you? I ran on the ground. My dad was actually by then in the balcony with the dressing room. A lot of the Indians had reached there. But the moment that last wicket falls, I turn to the West Indians who've been around me and say a word that we can't utter on air and say, we've done it. And I take a half, there's a beer can which is half drunk. The West Indian gives it to me and I take the beer can, swig it completely out, throw it onto the ground, and I rush there. And, somebody's got a tiranga in the hand. I catch that, he gives me the tiranga, and there we are, in front of this great Lord's Pavilion, waiting for Kapil Dev to hold the cup and just shouting madly. I don't think we knew what we were doing. When you're 18 and you've had your beer and you're at Lord's and you won the World Cup, each one of us felt, 50 feet tall that day. It was just unbelievable. It is just so special. Nikhil, it's difficult to put it in words. But I think it's the moment we came of age, Indian cricket came of age, and in a very tough time for India, with terrorism lurking in Punjab and difficult times in places like Assam and Kashmir, it lifted the national spirit and mood.
What a moment it was. It was a moment that completely changed the landscape of cricket, not just Indian cricket, because behind me, you could see the famous long room where the MCC members used to sit. This used to be the power center of cricket. All of that changed after the 1983 win that India registered. Underdogs to world champions. That is going to be our next episode. How this particular win had an impact on the next World Cup, 1987, because for the very first time, it travels outside of the UK, hosted by both India and Pakistan. That'll be my next episode. But just the final word on the 83 win. India has gone on to win more World Cups after that. But as they always say, that this will be the Neil Armstrong moment, because the first man on the moon will always be the first man on the moon. That's all that we have for you at this moment from Rajdeep and I. Thank you so much for watching.
Enjoy.